Hello, Owls, and welcome to week 3 of ACT English for Owls. This week, we got a couple of things going on, and I'm excited to share some great news. Last week, you probably took the pretest. If you didn't take the pretest, there's still time for you to be able to take it, and I'll review that at the end and put those links back in the comments. You can always take the pretest if you want to. That way, if you feel like, hey, I sure would like a score on some of this stuff and see how I actually do as a baseline, then I hope you consider doing that. But if you didn't take the pretest, that's fine. We can still continue on and have some great time together. Okay, we'll introduce the 6 different types of question categories today. The ACT has 6 different types of questions on the English test. We'll take a look at each section and take a look at each of the categories within them. And then we'll determine your strengths based on your experiences of the pretest, prioritize your needs, and then get ready for week 4. So let's get started. If you took the pretest, I want you to spend a couple of minutes thinking about what it was like for you to take that pretest. Did you run out of time? 75 questions, 40 minutes, that's just not a lot of time on each question. So if you took the pretest, did you run out of time? Did you have time left over, which a lot of you probably did not? Or did you get exactly right, which some of you may have, but most of you probably found yourself running out of time? Did you feel confident about what the questions were asking? In some instances, the questions might be long and look difficult and you weren't even sure what they were asking. Other times you knew what they were asking, but maybe you just did or did not know the answer. Did you feel confident about selecting the best answer? Once you'd reviewed the 4 choices, did you feel like, yes, I absolutely understand why I picked the one that I did? Or did you end up doing a lot of guessing? Did you tend to get more answers incorrect later in the test? And for those of you who took the pretest, you might notice that if you look at how frequently you missed questions, that frequency may pick up toward the end of the test, which means you're running out of time, guessing more often, or just kind of leaving questions unanswered because you ran out of time. And then finally, was your score a surprise? Did it accurately reflect your skills? A lot of students are a little bit surprised when they take the English test for the first time, because even though they have the knowledge, there's the whole environment of taking a test in a timed environment, in a strict standardized testing environment. And that can sometimes interrupt an otherwise good score. If you had all the time in the world, or you could listen to music, or you could kind of relax, your score might be a little bit better, but that's not what the environment that the ACT offers. So we want to replicate as often as possible the actual testing environment so that your score matches not necessarily what you know, but matches how you're going to do on actual test day. Now, the better you understand the answers to these questions, the more strategic you can be about improving your score. We'll talk a little bit later on, but if time is your biggest enemy, that's one set of skills you need to improve. If knowledge and skills are your biggest enemy, then that's a different set of skills that you want to improve. So I would urge you to consider taking the pretest. You can do it in your own time. You don't have to do it during AI time. And I'll give the links at the end of the presentation today. Okay, let's talk about the 6 question categories. On the ACT English test, 75 questions, 40 minutes, but you have 6 different types of questions. And really the emphasis, the basis of this course will be week by week going through a different category and looking at the sentence structure questions. We're looking at the punctuation questions. So we can just drill down on that specific skill set, because the answers and ability to answer sentence structure questions are much different than the type of knowledge and skills that you need to answer punctuation, knowledge of language, and so forth and so on. So let's take a look at sentence structure. This is the first type of question that you see on the English test. And for each of these, I'm going to show you a sample question. I'm going to review the types of skills that are assessed in these type of questions. But the basic question is, can you determine when a sentence is complete and correct? And for the most part, if you can tell the difference between a complete sentence or an incomplete sentence, or an independent clause versus a dependent clause, or a sentence fragment, you don't necessarily have to know those terms. But if you can eyeball a sentence and say, okay, that is correct, there is nothing wrong with that, or, oh, there's a major issue here, what would it take to fix that? Then you're well on your way to improving your score. Things like adjectives, clauses, conjunctions, fragments, modifiers, you see that list off to the side. You don't have to know those terms, but that's what the ACT tells me as a teacher are important to teach, to make sure that you can do well on the sentence structure question. So let's take a look at the actual sentence. The empty beach, with waves pushing so far onto shore that they would have knocked down sandcastles in July, is our favorite sight. That's the question. Now, question number 33 asks you to take a look at is our, and then decide, are there no changes, or were my, or was my, or are our. Now for today's lesson, we're just going to kind of eyeball it, and I'll show you where your head should be at. In future lessons, we'll take a look at actually finding and analyzing and figuring out. But the end of the day, this is a no change question, because if you can look at, and I'll try and use my mouse here, the empty beach is your subject, and is your predicate, or is your predicate. What you have here is a comma here and a comma here, and everything in between there is what we call an interrupter, with waves pushing out so far and to shore that they would have knocked down sandcastles in July. Well, folks, that's just an interrupting phrase. The actual meat and potatoes of the sentence is the empty beach is our favorite site. So the empty beach were my favorite site, was my favorite site, or are our favorite site. I can see how was my would become pretty close, but we talk about my friends and things like that. So is my favorite site is the correct answer. That's an example of a sentence structure question. And what you mainly have to do is eliminate the parts of the sentence that don't need to be there, like this interrupting phrase, and see what you're left with. The empty beach is our favorite site. That's a perfectly good sentence, so no change needed there. The second type of category is punctuation. Again, can you determine when the correct punctuation is used? Now, the ACT does have a habit of mostly testing commas, but they'll also test dashes, hyphens, semicolons, colons, and things like that. But there might only be a couple of questions like that. Generally speaking, it's the use of commas, and that's the example that we have here. You can see on the list to the left there all of the skills that they're measuring: apostrophes, positives, clauses, colon, things like that. But let's take a look at our sentence. 4 shipbuilders constructed the Min by using many of the same tools, materials, and techniques that the shipbuilders of Wadi Oasis had used. Now, that's a perfectly good sentence. I will tell you there is a punctuation error, but in terms of your word choice, sentence structure, everything sounds good. When you read that out loud, there are no mistakes in that sentence. 4 shipbuilders constructed the Min by using many of the same tools, materials, and techniques that the shipbuilders of Wadi Oasis had used. Perfectly good sentence, but we do have an error there. If you are an expert in commas, you would know that you do not put a comma when you're using a series after the last item. So tools, comma, is correct. Materials, comma, is correct. And techniques, and here's our error. That comma does not need to be there, because when you have a list of 3 or more things, you do not use a comma before the last or after the last item. So tools, comma, materials, comma, and techniques that the shipbuilders use. That is offered in answer number H there. Notice that G has an extra comma after and that we do not need. And we do need commas there, so J is incorrect. So tools, comma, materials, comma, and techniques, without the comma after techniques, that the shipbuilders of Wadi Oasis had used. A great example of a punctuation question. If you know how commas are used in a series, then you would know that a comma is not needed after techniques. All right. Our third area is knowledge of language, and I want to draw a distinction between knowledge of language and usage, which is our next category. Generally speaking, knowledge of language questions ask you which is the better word or the best word. That doesn't mean that the word is incorrect the way it is used, but sometimes they're just like wildly a bad choice, and there's a much better choice in one of your answers. But let's take a look at this. Nearby house, their yard was a huge unruly garden, and they want to know about the word unruly. Which of the following choices best indicates the disorder of the garden? So if you have words like contradictory or stormy or blatant, contradictory and stormy could imply disorder. Blatant is sort of just a random word thrown in there. It's your foil. It's not going to be anything. So we can kind of narrow down and say, okay, their yard was a huge unruly garden. Now you do kind of have to know what the word unruly means, and it just generally means kind of out of control. So contradictory garden, I don't know what a contradictory garden would be. It does imply disorder to some extent, but a contradictory garden wouldn't make sense. Same with stormy. Yes, stormy kind of implies disorder, but I don't know what a stormy garden would be. And then blatant, maybe you don't even know what that word means, but a blatant garden, that doesn't even imply disorder. So that's not even going to be an option. I like unruly. Their yard was a huge unruly garden. It implies that things were overgrown, had taken out of control. And if you look at the rest of the sentence, like a neighborhood park that had been taken over by wildflowers and weeds, Well, that would be unruly. If it's overtaken by weeds, that's an unruly garden. It's out of control. It's not a contradictory garden. It's not a stormy garden, and it's not a blatant garden. So here's a good example of a knowledge of language question, because it's really asking you, look, we're giving you a word. Maybe it's close to the best word, but is there a better word? So on the knowledge of language questions, you are really asking what's the better or best word. It's not always what's the right or wrong word. Those tend to be our next section, usage questions. Can you determine when the right word or phrase is used? Usage questions do typically happen to be there is a right answer and a wrong answer. And here's a good example. A site named Wadi Oasis in the Egypt's desert. Well, I'm not sure that Egypt's as a possessive makes sense here. Let's look at our options. A site named Wadi Oasis in the Egypt's desert. We know that's not correct. So F is not going to be an option for us. A site named Wadi Oasis in the Egyptians' desert. Well, I don't know why this is possessive. We don't need the adjective Egyptians as a possessive there. A site named Wadi Oasis in the Egyptians' desert. I don't know why that needs to be plural. The S at the end of the answer choice H doesn't sit well with me. But then we get to J, and suddenly the sky is clear, and we seem to have a pretty good option. A site named Wadi Oasis in the Egyptian desert. That makes a lot more sense. Notice that F is incorrect, G is incorrect, and H is incorrect. J is the only correct option. So usage questions target right or wrong, whereas knowledge of language questions focus better or best. Next, we come to topic development. I want to have a quick conversation about topic development questions because they are the easiest questions. They are also the longest questions. Also, they are the fewest questions. Topic development questions, generally between 5 and 7 questions of the 75 are these topic development. These questions ask, can you determine when ideas are most efficiently presented? This and organization tends to be a much longer question. So the good news is when you get to a long question like this, the question's long, the answer choices are long, the amount of underlining done in the text is long. The good news is just give it your full attention and you're almost always going to get these right because it kind of makes sense. Now, I'm not going to analyze this one a whole lot because we need to see the whole paragraph and I've just chunked out this little piece of it, but it does ask, given all the choices are true. So right away, you know, there's no wrong answer. There is a better or best answer below. Which one most effectively introduces the paragraph and provides a transition into the rest of the essay? In order to answer that, we would need to have the rest of the essay on the screen, but we're not going to do that here. I just need to introduce you to a topic development question. And you have no change. And unlike the Pacific Ocean with so much and so forth, Michigan has 2,000 to 300,000, whatever, miles of Great Lakes. And then, so notice that all of these have numbers in them. And maybe the square footage or miles has a great deal to do with the rest of the essay. But my inclination, without seeing the rest of it, is the underlined passage. The Great Lakes region is also referred to as the fresh coast because of its fresh water. If the rest of the passage is sort of about fresh water, then no change is probably your best answer. If the rest of the passage has to do with the dimensions and the size, then all those numbers and answer choices B, C, and D might become relevant. But when I look at the remaining sentences, it doesn't feel like an ocean water when we surf it. The fresh water, I sort of am inclined to believe it might be no change, but I'd need to see the rest of it. But the most important thing is that these topic development questions tend to be much longer, but they also tend to be much easier. You don't necessarily need to know how commas are used in a series in order to understand that, hey, this is probably the best sentence to introduce what the rest of the essay is talking about. And then finally, let's get to organization. Can you determine when ideas are most efficiently organized? These tend to be easier to answer. They don't require a strong skill set. You don't have to know how nouns and verbs, subject, predicates, apostrophes, and appositives work. You do have to just kind of look at this and kind of figure them out. And this one is a good example. Our passage indicates planks pocketed with holes bored by shipworms, creatures that live only in salt water, supported the hypothesis that ancient Egyptians had ventured into the ocean. It's asking about, number 4, creatures that live only in salt water. Notice that this is an interrupting phrase. The actual sentence is planks pocketed with holes bored by shipworms supported the hypothesis that so on, so on. So we have this interrupting phrase, creatures that live only in salt water. And the question says, if the writer were to delete the underlined portion, adjusting the punctuation as needed, the paragraph would primarily lose an explanation of why. Now, it's asking if we took out the underlined part and just left planks pocketed with holes bored and shipworms supported the hypothesis. So it's asking, what is it about creatures that live only in salt water might make it important to the rest of the passage? Well, our answer choices are evidence of shipworms could indicate that the Swadigawasis ships had sailed the ocean. I like that because oceans have salt water, and knowing that we live only in salt water implies that, well, they could only sail in the ocean because they only lived in salt water. So these shipworms would live in salt water, and because there is evidence of they were eaten away at the ship, and perhaps that's proof that they lived in the ocean. Or archaeologists thought the Punt was a destination of Wadi Gawas's expedition. I am not sure how in the world eliminating this passage would lose an explanation of anything we really haven't talked about. We haven't talked about the expedition. We hadn't talked about the Punt. We hadn't talked about archaeologists. None of these really have anything to do with the underlying passage. Next, shipworms may have bored holes in the planks of Wadi Gawas's ships. Well, we knew that they bored holes in the ships. That is information that we learn without having to deal with the underlying thing. So even if we took out creatures that live only in salt water, we would still know that those shipworms bored holes in the ships. And then there was evidence of shipworms. Well, we already know that. So let's take a look. Working bottom up, J, there was evidence of shipworms is already confirmed by the ununderlined part. Shipworms may have bored holes is also confirmed in the ununderlined part. Archaeologists thought Punt was a destination. That's not even part of what's underlined. And then F, evidence of shipworms could indicate that the Wadi Gawasa ships had sailed the ocean. What I'm seeing here is that the underlined portion contains information that is A, not included elsewhere in the paragraph, and B, does seem to indicate that they had sailed the ocean, which is salt water, which is right here. So I like answer F, okay? Answer F, that first one does seem to be the correct one. Okay, that's it. Those are the 6 types of ACT questions. If you took the ACT pretest, go ahead and pause the screen. You can use your phone if you want to, and I'm not including this as part of our weekly test, but if you want to, you could pause your screen and look at your answers to each of the following questions and determine where your strengths are. So here's how to do that. Sentence structure, answers 24 to 33, 40, 43, and so on. Those are all sentence structure questions that you took as part of your pretest. Punctuation, usage, knowledge of language, and so forth. What this might do is if you wanted to say, look, what percentage of my sentence structure questions am I missing? What percentage of my punctuation questions am I missing? What percentage, and so forth and so on. And you might find out that there are a couple of areas that you scored far worse in or far better in. But if you're like most students, your biggest hit came on the sentence structure and punctuation questions. Your third worst area was the organization. Your usage and knowledge of language were 4th and 5th place, and then topic development was your best area. So if you want to, like I said, pause this, do some math, look at your pretest results, go question by question, and see if there's a category that you did worse or best in. But I will tell you, if you're like most students, it's sentence structure and punctuation. Okay, let's take a look at those questions that we asked earlier. If you happen to do this slide right here and you actually did some math, you'd probably figure out where your difficulties were. But generally speaking, if you took the pretest, let's look at these questions. If you ran out of time or had leftover time or got it perfect, that is a time skill. We need to work on your timing of the test. Did you feel confident about what the questions were asking? That is a comprehension. You either knew the answer or you didn't know the answer, and that is more related to comprehension than time. Did you feel confident about selecting the best answer? That's a skill. In other words, you knew what the question was asking, you had plenty of time, but you just didn't know the right or wrong answer. That's a skill issue. Did you tend to get more answers incorrect in the later in the test? That's a pacing issue. And then was your score a surprise? Did it accurately reflect your skills? That's a knowledge issue. So to look at that little box below, you're in one of 4 categories after having taken the pretest or after taking the English test for the first time. I know it and have the time. That's great. If you're in box A, you're on your way to a great score, and that's great. B, I knew the information. In other words, I understood the question, I understood the answer, I knew what the right answer was, but I needed more time to figure out, then your biggest deficit is probably time and pacing. C, I didn't know it and I have the time. So in other words, you had maybe 5-10 minutes left at the end of the test, but you still did very poorly. That's comprehension, knowledge, and skill issues. And then D, I don't know it and don't have the time. That's sort of all of the above, and we need to kind of work through those. Each week, we're going to take, for the whole semester, we're going to take a little bit of time. Sometimes we'll talk about time and pacing. Sometimes we'll talk about comprehension, knowledge, and skill, but we'll work it through in all the next semester. Okay, if you decided that you want to take the pretest, you don't have to take that during AI time. You can take that on your own time. Just try and replicate the testing environment as much as possible. Put 40 minutes on your clock. I will put these links down below in the comments so you can link right on them, or you can click on the click here for ACT materials. That's how you're going to do the pretest if you still want to take it. And then let's take a look at week 4. We're going to use the grid in determining the strengths to figure out which of the 6 areas are your strongest and weaknesses, or we're just going to start with sentence structure. And week 4, we really begin getting underway with some actual comprehension, knowledge, and skills. What makes a sentence incomplete? What makes a sentence complete? What's a subject? What's a predicate? What's a noun and a verb? And we'll take it from there. So that's it for this week, Owls. I hope you had a great week, and we'll see you next week, and have a good one.